Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Micklos, and today we are going to be talking about the story of watches with the NASA space program. I'm first going to be just talking a little bit about the history of watches with the space program, mainly with Apollo. And then I'm just going to be transitioning more to a personal story of a watch that was flown for me by one of our astronauts. But first I'd like to say thank you for letting me be a part of Watches and Wonder. And obviously I have to tell you what kind of watch I'm wearing. This is my mother's watch. She bought it on her first trip to Switzerland in 1954, and it's an Omega and still ticking. It's only had one ruby replaced. So let me go ahead and just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been with NASA, rather than talking years, I like talking launches and landings. So I've been with the Space Shuttle program. I was with that program for 112 launches and landings. And the current program that I'm a part of now, which is called the Launch Services Program, in the 6 years I've been with that program, we've launched 35 rockets. And so it's been an amazing career out at the Kennedy Space Center. Started out as a thermal protection engineer, ended up becoming the airframe lead for the Space Shuttle Columbia. Became a project manager after that to ensure any type of modifications we needed to do to the space shuttles, which was wonderful to be able to be a part of that after we, to improve the safety of the vehicles. And then with the current position I'm in, I am a mission assurance engineer, ensuring the safety of all the space flights and to ensure either our spacecrafts and or our astronauts get safely to where they need to go. But first, let's just talk a little bit, backtrack a little bit, because this is a 50-year anniversary, not only for our first Apollo moon landing, but as well as the significance of how watches became an integral part of NASA's program. So when the Apollo mission started, it was, to me, watches were a significant part to that program, because if you think about it, space flight back in the early 60s, when it came down to how you build a rocket, how you launch a rocket in space, those are all things that the common person can kind of understand, but it's difficult. But wearing a watch is something that humanizes space program. And that was one of the things that NASA realized that you needed a watch that can survive the severe environments of space. Now with the Apollo program, when that rocket launched, anything in that crew cabin was seeing 6 Gs of gravitational force as it left Earth's atmosphere. So that's a lot of force. So the watch that had to be designed had to be able to survive that type of environment during the launch. So also with that, back in the Apollo days, that the watch also not even having to survive the pressures of being in space, but as well as had to survive the severe temperature changes. So when Neil Armstrong left the cabin to walk on the moon, not only was he going from a pressurized environment in his crew cabin, but he was then walking out into the vacuum of space. With that being said, there's also severe temperature changes depending on where the sun is on the moon. So again, that watch had to survive, get my statistics right, to 120 degrees Fahrenheit to going down to below 160 degrees. So not your average way you would design a watch for Earth, but these were the requirements that were necessary to survive to be a part of space flight. So with that being said, the Omega, the Omega Speedmaster was the first watch be certified by NASA for space flight. And like we had said, this is also that watch's 50th year anniversary to celebrate space flight as well. You may notice the large band on that watch, and if we go back one picture, oops, there we go. On the astronaut's right hand, you can see the band, which is them actually wearing that watch during the moonwalk. And there was a fun story I read about with these particular watches. Because the watches were given to the astronauts as official crew equipment, it was just like a spacesuit or anything else. But again, the watch, sometimes the astronauts would keep them. Even though they have personal watches, they'd also have the official watches that were given by NASA. But NASA wanted those watches back in order to give them to the next set of astronauts that would be flying. And they had asked some of the astronauts to give them back, and unfortunately, they didn't get them all back. So they had to bribe the astronauts to say, we're not going to allow you to fly in the T-38 planes, which is the personal jets that the astronauts use from going to the Johnson Space Center to the Kennedy Space Center, unless you give us the watches back. They got the watches back. But obviously, there are personal watches that the astronauts use, which are in museums today. So with that being said, with the Apollo program, then came the Space Shuttle program. And watches continued to be an integral part of the program. If you look at this picture here, you can see some of the astronauts that are wearing 3 or 4 different watches. Some of those are personal watches, some of those are watches that they needed for the scientific experiments that are being performed, or they're wearing watches that are being flown for a family member or a friend that would be returned to them, returned to that person upon the ending of that mission. And what I learned working on the shuttle program is watches were one of those items that were very prized to be flown. Because once again, once the watch came back from space, it was given to someone. It's something you can wear every day. But not too many people could say that this watch has been around the Earth or has traveled 3 million miles. Kind of a nice little statistic there. And just to say that it's been in outer space. So watches have everything that's always flown on the space shuttle for personal items. Watches, I think, has always been one of the #1 things to be flown. So I had an opportunity to have a watch flown in space. I was dating an astronaut, Dave Brown, and he was assigned to the mission on Columbia, STS-107, which happened to be the mission that I was assigned to as an engineer for the thermal protection system and for the structural systems. So it was really unique being able to prepare his shuttle for his mission. So it was about 6 months prior to the shuttle mission, and I was in Connecticut celebrating my birthday. And Dave wasn't able to come with me, but he said, I'm going to be sending you your birthday present to Connecticut. Like, wonderful. So the present kindly comes, and I see it's a watch box. I'm like, oh, great. And I open up the box, and the box is empty. Okay, the New Yorker kicks in, thinking, okay, who stole the watch? And I look at it more closely, and there is a little note that says, help, I've been hijacked aboard the space shuttle. I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, this is wonderful. So with that being said, I had no idea what the watch was, what it was going to look like, but it was just very exciting to know that I'm going to have one of those few and coveted watches that we're able to say has been on a space shuttle flight. So with that being said, we continued to prepare the space shuttle for its mission. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about the shuttle. Has anybody ever seen a shuttle launch? Yes, okay, we got a few hands here. Sometimes, obviously, the shuttle program has ended, but even in Miami area, if it's a night launch, you could certainly see it clear from here. But the space shuttle program, the space shuttle was a very unique vehicle. The orange tank was basically its gas tank, holding liquid oxygen and liquid fuel. And that was the fuel for the main engines. That tank only held 8 minutes of fuel to allow the shuttle going from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in 8.5 minutes. It's pretty darn fast. On either side, you had the solid rocket boosters. Those were used in the first 2.5 minutes during flight, and then those would be jettisoned off. And at that point, the shuttle was in a high enough atmosphere that the main engines could continue getting the shuttle going to its designated orbit. And then, of course, once the shuttle did get into space, it jettisoned the brown external tank, which at this point, 8.5 minutes later, would end up in the Indian Ocean. So that's how quickly it traveled. So with that being said, and also on the thermal protection system, that was the heat shield that also allowed the shuttle to come back into Earth's atmosphere, because the shuttle does get very hot coming back in. If you think about it, if you rub your hands together, your hands get very warm. Well, think about the friction of air molecules coming across the space shuttle when you're traveling 17,000 miles per hour, or Mach 25. You get a lot of friction and heat resistance going on. So needless to say, the shuttle is very integrated, but was a good spacecraft and always was able to do good missions. Nope. There we go. So now we finally get to launch day. This was on February 1st, 2003. It was an absolutely beautiful launch, went at the beginning of the window. It was a gorgeous blue day, and knowing that the crew got to orbit safely with all its payload, and the vehicle was ready to do 16 days of science experiments, which they had multiple experiments coordinated with the European Space Agency, as well as other schools across the United States. Unfortunately, as the crew was working on all their science experiments, we were actually busy on the ground, because what had happened was there was a piece of foam came off that external tank that we had talked about earlier and actually hit the left wing of the orbiter. The problem was that that literally was our clearest picture of what we had to understand what happened to where that foam strike was. So at that time, for the next 16 days, the engineering teams from the Johnson Space Center and the Kennedy Space Center went ahead and did all kinds of analysis to try to understand if that foam strike would still allow the shuttle to come home safely. And it was deemed finally on day 15 that it was acceptable for the shuttle to come in acceptably and allow the crew to come back home. So finally on, I think I got my dates wrong, I apologize for that. So on February 1st, 2003, now we're at the end of the shuttle mission. And we're going to let Columbia finally come back home and land at the Kennedy Space Center. And this is a picture of the shuttle runway at the Kennedy Space Center. I want to say it's 5 miles long, and it's it was built specifically for shuttle landings. And a part of my job at the time was to actually be on the runway during the shuttle landing, because one of the things that we would do would be to go ahead and then inspect the orbiter for any tile damages that may have occurred in the flight, as well as being able to then do a report and then start our repairs on the shuttle. Unfortunately, the shuttle did not land at Kennedy. This was the mission where the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up approximately 15 minutes from the Kennedy Space Center. That foam strike we were talking about actually did penetrate the wing and cause the space shuttle to lose aerodynamic stability, causing the space shuttle to be broke up. Where it ended up landing was in East Texas. You can see a map there showing the trajectory of the orbiter coming in, and then where all the pieces of Columbia were scattered. It was over a 200-mile length area, about 40 miles wide. So 200 miles by 40 miles wide. So obviously now, rather than working on landing, now we're in a search and recovery mode. So one of the things, the main things that was most important was to find the crew, which was done within the first week. The next part was now to try to understand exactly what happened to the space shuttle. So being a part of that team, I was asked to lead up the reconstruction effort back at the Kennedy Space Center to help identify all the parts and pieces of the shuttle when it came to the thermal protection system and the airframe in order to try to figure out, let the pieces of the puzzle tell us what happened to the vehicle. So why I'm working this reconstruction, in the back of my mind I'm thinking, what if they're ever going to find the watch? What are the odds of finding the watch? And I'm just kind of thinking, I thought about it and I thought the odds of finding it were impossible. Well, about a month after the accident, I got a phone call from Dave's family, and they had been notified by NASA that they had found the watch, which I could not believe. And this is a picture of the watch. So the watch, what was very interesting about it, the watch bands were gone. The face of the watch, the crystal of the watch was gone. The time of the watch was 9:07, which I thought was very unusual for two reasons. One, 9:07 was the declared time of the accident, and out of all the watches that were flown, this was the only one that came back with the correct time. The second thing I was surprised about was that Dave lived in Houston, and he actually sent it to the Eastern time zone, which I thought was pretty good forethinking. So needless to say, I finally did get that watch back, and it was very surprising to be able to bring that back into work, show it to my colleagues that had actually been processing that watch, and now being able to talk about it. But the real interesting story is a year later. So the year anniversary, the first anniversary of the loss of Columbia, my colleagues and I decided, they asked me what I wanted to do that day, and I said, I just want to go to the runway, have a moment of peace, and then we'll figure out what we'll do the rest of the day. It was a rainy, yucky day, and we decided that with that, we'd go out there, went out in the rain, had my moment of peace, went back in the van, and then we just started talking what we were all doing that day, or a year ago, when the accident happened. And one of my colleagues started saying he was on a team called the Rapid Responsive Team, which was a team that if you were having a bad day, which we had, unfortunately, They were one of the first group of people to go out there and kind of get the situation underneath control. So he was one of the first people out of the 30,000 people that were out there looking for the debris from Columbia. And he was commenting that on the first or second day when he was walking down the debris field, he saw something kind of flickered and there was light reflecting off of it. And so it caught his eye. And he said he bent down to pick it up and he could tell it was a rectangular watch. And my jaw just dropped. And I said, did it have a blue face? We all started crying. He found the watch in a debris field that's over, like I said, 200 miles wide or long, 40 miles wide, 30,000 people looking for the debris parts of the Space Shuttle Columbia. And with the tens of thousands of pieces of debris that was recovered, we only ended up recovering about 40% of the vehicle. I found the person that found that watch. So it really brought that whole tragedy to me to a closure, but it was something that I'll always treasure for the rest of my life. And what I also found interesting was that I noticed a lot of the crew members or the spouses from the crew members, they were always wearing the watch of their husband afterwards, because once again, it was that constant reminder of them, because it was a physical reminder of what they wore every day. So even though they didn't have watches that necessarily flew in face, that watch that they had, that their loved ones had left back at home, it was just that physical reminder of what that watch could bring. So needless to say, I had an opportunity on the next shuttle mission that the Astronaut Corps had asked me if I'd like to fly another watch, and I did. So I do have that watch with me, and I can safely say that that watch has spent 14 days in space. So it is a nice ending to this story. And this is a picture of the watch, the watch on Columbia, how it should have looked. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you for letting me talk a little bit about the history of watches with NASA, share my personal story, and I'm certainly looking forward to the next year, especially this year, of launching manned spaceflight back from the Kennedy Space Center. Since the end of the shuttle program, we've been launching our astronauts from Russia to go to the International Space Station. But this year, probably this summer, we are now going to be launching our astronauts on 2 commercial rockets. They're going to be launched either on a SpaceX Falcon 9, or they will be launched on an Atlas V rocket with a Boeing capsule on it. So we're now using commercial providers to launch our astronauts into space. So it's going to be a very exciting year to finally get manned space flight going back from the Kennedy Space Center. So I also have some NASA information down on the table here if anybody is interested. So please help yourself. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Yes?
Is the watch in your possession? Are you able to keep it, or did you have to go back to that?
No, I actually have it with me today, if you'd like to see it. Yep, it wasn't considered official crew equipment. It was considered a personal effects, Therefore, it could go back to the families. So yes, that did go back. Yes, yes. Do I ever wear the watch? That one, since I do not, since it does not have the bands to it, I felt I didn't feel it was right to get new bands to put it on. And also, it was something historical about, because somebody had mentioned, well, you should see if you can get the watch working again. And I thought of the significance of how it came back. And it's almost a moment in time. So the watch is kept just like that. The other watch that flew on the shuttle mission, I do wear daily. Yes. Yes. And it's always a nice reminder. Well, this is my, I have it in my bag. I had to wear my mom's watch today, so, for the Omega. But, yeah, but it's unusual to, it's something you casually bring up. It's nothing that, there's just a few watches that have flown in space. And, but the good news is with the manned spaceflight program starting back up, we'll be able to be launching more watches again. Yes?
What are your overall thoughts of the shuttle program? I mean, in the context of the Columbia and the Challenger, is the overall, was it a successful program in your thought,
I feel the overall program, it is a successful program. The overall program had 135 successful launches. And the shuttle program achieved what we were looking for, which was number one, to build the International Space Station, as well as launch some very significant scientific experiments to space, Hubble Space Telescope, as well as doing multiple microgravity experiments to better understand cell growth when it comes to doing cancer research and such. So the multitude of what the space shuttle did was immense. I think with the loss of Columbia and Challenger, and we can also mention our Apollo 1 astronauts that were, didn't even make it into space, but they lost their lives on a ground testing that they were doing. That, to me, astronauts known, it's a dangerous business. And it's not just astronauts, it's our fighter pilots, our first responders, anything else that people do. And I think with the accidents that NASA has had, the one thing that I know that any crew member who has lost their life is you want the program to learn your lessons and move on. And that's exactly what the space shuttle did after the loss of Columbia. We were able to spend 2.5 years doing modifications, fixing the things that we knew needed to be fixed, and allowing those last shuttle flights towards the end of the, well, after Columbia, to be probably the safest missions we ever had up until that very last mission. So I think the key takeaway is lessons learned and always moving forward, and how you can constantly continue improving so that you're providing the safest vehicle. Yes. Any other questions? All right, please help yourself to the things there. Thank you. Thank you. And I have the watch up here if anybody would like to take a look at it.